Before I introduce today's guest, this episode is brought to you by Wondrium. Wondrium is a series of college-level audio and video courses and documentaries produced and distributed by the Teaching Company. You know, the former Great Courses. You've heard me talk about them for many years now. They bring you engaging educational content through short-form videos, long-form courses, my favorites, tutorials, how-to lessons, travelogues, documentaries, my other favorite, and more. Check it out if you go to wondrium.com/Shermer, that is WONDRIUM, wondrium.com/Shermer. You get a free trial, 2 weeks. Why would you not take it up? It's free. And then 20% off your annual subscription rate. When you get the subscription, you get access to all their content. Just endless, hundreds and hundreds of these courses and whatnot. I just found a new one. I thought I had heard this course already. This is a different one. This kind of big history. I've been listening to all the big history courses they offer. This one's called The Big History of Civilizations, using cutting-edge historical approach to trace the story of human civilizations from our emergence as a species. 36 30-minute lectures. Oh boy, that'll keep me busy for at least a week, maybe more. A Tale of Two Ancient Cities, The Rise of Humanity, Foraging in the Old Stone Age. I guess that's the Paleolithic, right? Origins of Agriculture, Power, Cities, and States. It's all about power. You got to capture energy or else you can't have cities and states. The era of the agrarian civilizations, innovations of Mesopotamia, the downfall of Sumer, society and the culture of Egypt. I'm going to skip down here. Greek gods, philosophy and science, Islamic expansion and rule, culture and empire in South America. I'm just blasting down here. The Industrial Revolution, transformative 20th and 21st centuries. Here we are, 21st century, civilization, the biosphere, and tomorrow. And the last lecture, number 36, civilizations of the distant future. Love that subject. Wrote about that in my last chapter of the Moral Arc. Really cool stuff. Check it out. Go to wondrium.com/Shermer. Get your free trial and your of 2 weeks and your 20% discount. Why would you not try this? And it also supports the podcast. If you appreciate our work here, go to them, wondrium.com/Shermer, and that really makes a big difference. All right, thanks for listening. Here's our episode. All right, Andrew Doyle, we are rolling, and let me introduce you and the show properly. I am Michael Shermer, the publisher of Skeptic magazine. Here we go, our latest issue. As you know, you can pick up at skeptic.com digitally, or we can mail you a copy, or you can go to your local bookstore and pick one up. Our next issue comes out this coming week. We're recording this on September 9th. On Race Matters, our last one of the year of the quarterly is Nationalism Matters, so be sure and subscribe or pick it up at your local bookstore. My guest today is Andrew Doyle, writer, satirist, and political commentator. He regularly appears on television to discuss current affairs and is a panelist on the BBC's Moral Maze. He has written for a number of publications, including Telegraph, Sun, Daily Mail, Mail on Sunday, Standpoint, Spectator, and Sunday Times. He's the creator of the satirical character Titania McGrath, under whose name he has written 2 books, Woke, A Guide to Social Justice, and my first little book of intersectional activism. Titania McGrath has over 500,000 followers. Actually, I checked this, you're up about 750,000 now since your publicist wrote that little blurb. He was a visiting research fellow at Queen's University Belfast and a lecturer at Oxford University, where he completed his doctorate. His previous book was Free Speech and Why It Matters, on which he appeared on this show, amongst other shows. So he is our returning champion for his new book, The New Puritans, How the Religion of Social Justice Captured the Western World. I love this book, Andrew. I listened to it on audio. I love that you read your book. Christopher Hitchens always read his books. Richard Dawkins reads his books, and it's always better with that British accent, at least for us Americans.
Yeah, I don't love that I read the books because it's a very long, arduous process, and I always lose my voice because you're not used to speaking continuously for 4 days. But anyway, no, I do understand that it's better for the listener, isn't it?
Oh yeah, I like it because I feel like you're in my head a little bit more than on the printed page. But Andrew, since we're recording this on September 9th, the day after the Queen died, do you have any thoughts, reflections, commentary on that whole thing, the monarchy? Anything you'd like to say about that?
It's interesting. I've seen a lot of reactions, obviously, on social media, and there appears to be a genuine sense of bafflement amongst some sort of American accounts as to why it's had such an impact here. But I think you've got to understand that this is a figurehead who has really represented continuity in this country for so long. I mean, I've never known anyway. She's always been there, in my entire lifespan, and that's the case for most people, unless you're very old and you can just remember the king who preceded her. But really, she's just been something that is taken as a given. So I think people are very obviously it was inevitable. She was 96. This is something that everyone knew was coming, but it still has an emotional impact. And I think I have noticed a lot of the sort of kind of vicious gloating style attacks on social media. I mean, all of them have got pronouns in their bio. I can't help but notice this correlation. There's something about the ideology that I write about in my book that yokes itself to cruelty, inhumanity, and just kind of vaguely unempathetic behavior. So I'm sure we'll get onto that. But yeah, it's all obviously sad when anyone dies. I don't know her personally, obviously, but I understand why people feel emotionally invested.
Kind of like when Princess Diana died as well. People don't know her, but I guess if you're so familiar with somebody, it feels like a family member or friend has died, and so there is a sense of grief there.
Yeah, I think that's right, and it feels. I suppose it's a reminder of the inevitability of change. That that we're moving into a new era. Things are moving on. We're all getting older. The certainties of our past are falling away. That's something that it's we're reflecting on ourselves now, I suppose, when something like this happens.
Well, there was that tweet by the woman that got taken down where she said, that she was the representative of colonialism, and may she die in miserable pain and agony.
Yeah. It's just interesting, isn't it? Because even if you're a Republican, even if you oppose the existence of the monarchy, it's interesting to me that people who are so ideologically captured just forget basic humanity. It just goes out of the window for them because they have, to such an extent, demonized those who either disagree with them or those who represent positions that they don't adhere to. And effectively, that means that explains the kind of inhumanity and the ferocity of these activists, and not just when it comes to the death of the Queen or the death of anyone. They do tend to have this thing, though. They do have this tendency to celebrate when their political opponents die, which I think is such a sort of grim quality that doesn't reflect well on you. You don't come across well if you're that kind of person. It exposes something quite fundamental about what type of human being you are if you just have no compassion for other individuals. And it also is a testament to the way in which they see their opponents as literally less than human. They see them as subhuman. I suppose it goes back to the inquisitors who strapped women to the rack and would burn heretics at the stake, and they had no compunction about this because they felt that they were doing so because God willed it. I'm sure the fighters of ISIS believe that in beheading their captives that they are doing God's work and doing a moral good. And that's a really disturbing, when you reach that level of ideological capture and you lose your humanity, I suppose. And that's actually largely what my book is about. The reason I wrote The New Puritans is because I'm trying to understand how human beings, often intelligent, decent, well-intentioned human beings, can lose their moral compass, can completely surrender that sense of basic human compassion. And why has it happened? And why is it so common? And I don't know if I've got the answers or not, but I've had a stab at it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of my favorite documentary film series was James Burke's The Day the Universe Changed, the sequel to his Connections. And in one of the segments, he has a reconstructed, with actors, witch burning. And this goes on for like 15 minutes in the show, where they show the woman being tortured and all the spectral evidence presented against her and the pressure for her to confess, all the way up to the moment that she's burned alive at the stake with mobs of people cheering this on. And Burke says, what you're watching is not what these people are seeing. You're seeing something completely different. This is a different kind of way of thinking. They think they're saving her soul. They're doing her a favor, right?
Yeah.
And that's how you open your book. I mean, I love that you open it with the witch craze.
I mean, that's fascinating to me. It's something, I mean, if you take back in the Elizabethan era here, back in the 1600s, people would take their kids out to watch a public execution. I mean, it would be a family day out where, you know, you'd see people's entrails drawn out and people literally hung, drawn, and quartered. That was the thing. And how does it make sense? I mean, you'd like to feel that you couldn't possibly have participated in that kind of thing. But, you know, there is that side of humanity. Yeah, and I start and end the new book with the Salem witch trials, very specifically because I'm interested in that moment in history. I think tells us a lot about the nature of hysteria, and it was such a short-lived burst of hysteria. You know, a little over a year, 1692 to the early part of 1693, and you have this community of people, God-fearing, decent, good people in New England, the Puritans of New England, who were not witch hunters. This wasn't something they did. They didn't go around accusing people of witchcraft and burning them at the stake or anything. This was an aberration. This was really, really unusual. And why I was so interested in this is what happened, and why was it that such a God-fearing village would suddenly behave in this diabolical way? They all repented afterwards. They all realized it was wrong afterwards. But what captured their minds? And I see it as analogous to our cancel culture, insofar as a lot of the people doing the cancelling, a lot of the people driving people out of their jobs and complaining to employers, getting them fired, and not even stopping there, trying to destroy their reputation, making sure they never work again. Those people, and they think they're doing it for the right reasons, right? And although people aren't being hanged for speaking the truth today, there's a lot at stake. You can still lose your livelihood. You can still lose your job if you speak out and say, actually, these activists have got it all wrong. You know, there are two biological sexes, etc. These statements, which should be fairly innocuous, have now become very dangerous. And that to me is really interesting. And the other thing about it, I think, which I thought was quite illuminating, was, you know, to see the girls in Salem who made the accusations, who cried witch on all these people, these girls who may well have been caught in a collective fantasy, a collective hysteria, that it wouldn't have, there would have been no consequences to that had not the elites bought into it and perpetuated. I mean by that the magistrates, the ministers, the people in authority. And I see that as very much analogous to today. We live in a world where activists online with their anime avatars can scream out that people are transphobes, racists, homophobes, fascists even. They throw these words out like confetti. And it's a hysteria that they're either experiencing or deliberately indulging in. And nothing would happen if we just ignored them. But what happens? The people in authority, the elites, the equivalent of the magistrates and the ministers of Salem. We're talking about the politicians here. We're talking about the civil service. We're talking about the NHS. We're talking about people, the police even here in the UK, people in power. It just takes a few tweets from these crazy people, and the elites say, okay, we'll buy into your hysteria, or we'll at least play along. And I think that's where the comparison lies. And the more I read of Salem, the more I realized that many of those in power didn't believe it. I mean, there's so many examples of when the girls accused a local dignitary, someone who was just too powerful, such as the wife of the colony's governor, such as the Reverend Samuel Willard, who was the acting president of Harvard. These people, when they accused those guys, the magistrate said, no, you've made a mistake. You've made and then they moved on. So that suggests to me they didn't quite fully believe it. I sometimes even doubt whether the girls did. Sometimes, you know, when they were in, where was it? Was it Topsfield? It's where Andover, I think, where they'd moved on from Salem to Andover, and they accused a local dignitary there, very rich man. And I mentioned this in my book. He said, okay, I'll sue you. He put out a writ for defamation, and they shut up and moved on. Well, the devil doesn't shut up, right? And that suggests to me there was an inauthenticity about it for a lot of people. But everyone was terrified because they knew that if they stood up and said, no, there are no witches, they would be the next to be accused. And that, of course, is analogous to cancel culture today. I mean, I get messages all the time from people saying, I'm glad you're speaking out against these people, but I never, ever could. And they say, I'm sure you must get these private messages, because they know that it comes with, there are serious risks to speaking truth, to saying, no, we don't live in a society full of fascists. No, there are no witches in the shadows. It's a risky proposition. And so I'm not drawing the parallels flippantly. I am doing so, or to say that it's the same. What I'm doing so is to try and use that story, use that precedent to expose something about the situation we find ourselves in now. And I think that's quite an illuminating comparison to make.
Yeah, I think you meant it quite well. I did the same thing in my first book, Why People Believe Weird Things, about the satanic panic of the 1980s and then the recovered memory movement in the 1990s as both kind of witch crazes or witch hunts, where, you had just traces of evidence that somebody could interpret, like mutilated cats or dogs or kind of weird things that people would find and thought, well, there's a satanic cult. And then this spread. This was after the McMartin preschool case here in Southern California, the longest, most expensive trial in history, in which these, preschool kids were allegedly victims of this satanic cult, pedophile cult at this preschool in Manhattan Beach. And, and the stories just went on, and people said, well, children would never make anything up like this, right? And then, of course, the police interrogators would give them these little anatomically correct dolls and say, point to where he touched you, and when you tell us, then you can see your mommy again. Of course, the poor kid's scared out of his wits there, and okay, it was right there. Aha, evidence, right? And the same thing with the satanic panic, until the FBI finally got involved, because, it got to the point where it was like every city in America has a satanic cult. And the FBI said, all right, well, we better look into this. And they didn't find any, not one, right? And so that kind of brought it to an end. The recovered memory movement was brought to an end when victims, the guys that were accused of molesting their now adult daughters when they were children, sued the therapist for planting false memories, and that brought it to a quick halt. Lawsuits. So back to your opening account, people in the witch crazes back in those days who had money or had power, they were pretty safe. It was the victims were mostly poor people and older women without power or any kind of standing. Those were the victims who were not allowed to fight back. So really fighting back is the only thing that can be done.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was when people were fleeing from the county, the efforts to recover those people were not so stringent if they were richer people. And they went, they found, I think they went to New York, a lot of them, or what was New Amsterdam at that point. But they found solace there because the Dutch didn't have much truck for these kind of spectral ideas, I guess. But it's interesting that you mentioned the law element, the legal element, because we're finding now that I think a lot of the way out is through challenging things through the courts. I mean, the satanic witch hunts of the 1980s. I mean, we should learn a lot from that. We never do learn, do we? We it's very strange. We had a similar situation here relatively recently, I think, called Operation Midland, which was a police investigation into accusations of not satanic, but a murderous paedophile ring at the heart of Westminster, at the heart of government. And there were clearly fabricated accounts by a man called Carl Beach. And then there were other people making these accounts of saying things like the Prime Minister Ted Heath was at a sex session where one of the children was murdered. Stuff that obviously wasn't true. And the police here, the Scotland Yard, went on television and said that these accusations were credible and true. That was the phrase they used, credible and true. Bypassing due process, we'd reached a kind of hysteria because a number of very prominent individuals, sex offenders, hadn't been caught, hadn't been held to trial. And for instance, the Jimmy Savile case, it only came out after he had died. And as a result of that, the police, suddenly the Crown Prosecution Service here, were saying any accusation must be believed and we must push it through right to the end. I know someone who was caught up in this, completely falsely accused, and it was so obvious it wasn't real, it wasn't true, but the police they went at it with a zeal. And the scary thing is, I'm pretty sure the police knew it wasn't true. They just wanted to convict. And I think you saw the same with the satanic trials. I mean, there's a really good book by Richard Webster called The Secret of Brynestyn, which is about the care home paedophile ring scandals of the 1980s in Wales. Most of them driven by one particular fantasist, who then went on and that idea, and there are people still in prison from that. I think it's really frightening when people get. And again, in that case, you can tell as you read the book that a lot of the children who were children and then adults started to believe their own fantasies, started to believe the things that had been suggested to them in the phrasing of the questions by the police, by the therapist, this kind of thing, and it just blew up. And it's a reminder, isn't it, of that human tendency. And that our memory isn't necessarily reliable. And also with a lot of these moral panics, there's often a grain of truth to it. There's often something that makes it plausible. I mean, I think in Salem, because Tituba, who was the household slave of the Reverend Paris, was enacting spells that she'd picked up in Barbados. Of course, they weren't supernatural. They were games more than anything. They were game to entertain the children, and it was all harmless. But because of that, in a Puritan Christian community, that seems, frightening. And there's elements of that. I mean, there's things like in some of these moral panics. I don't know if you've ever seen the film Capturing the Freedmans, which is about a famous a case in America where a whole family and a number of members in the family were prosecuted for paedophilia. And as you watch this film, I don't know what happened there. I don't know. But as you watch the film, you can see that some of the people making accusations are making these accusations that cannot possibly be true. They're so outlandish and so extreme. And yet you see the father in that family was caught with paedophilic magazines. So you see that grain of truth then suddenly spurs on and sparks that it gives a kind of engine to the fantasy. You know what I mean? And I think that's the problem here in our cancel culture, is that there are some fascists in our society. There are some unpleasant, racist, horrendous people. And when you see those, and what activists do is they highlight and amplify those to suggest that it is representative of a broader trend, of a broader problem. And it isn't. So, and that's the problem. When people like me talk about, we need evidence, when there's an accusation of systemic racism in any particular institution, we need evidence of that. People will say, oh, so you're denying that racism exists. And of course, I'm not denying that racism exists. What I'm saying is our country, the UK, happens to be one of the least racist countries that has ever existed on the planet Earth. And it is not socially acceptable to be racist. And institutions like Oxford University don't have racism built into their system, because if they did, there would be some evidence of that. And all of the evidence tells us that that's not the case. And I'm just saying, we need to move beyond emotional hysteria. We need to go back to those values of the Enlightenment, evidence-led epistemology, assessing the data, weighing up the facts, not just, I felt it, therefore it's true. What they call my lived experience, what the witch hunters in Salem called spectral evidence. It was down to the lived experience of the girls who cried witch. Didn't matter that no one else could see the witches. Didn't matter that anyone else could see their spirits flying out and pinching them in court. Though that was the lived experience of those girls, and that was what secured the testimony. And it's also, by the way, as you will know, what caused the hysteria to end. Because at the end, the deputy governor of the colony wrote to the leading clergymen of the country and said, by the way, is spectral evidence admissible in court? And they all said, no. What are you doing? You can't. And that's all they had. All they had was spectral evidence. They had nothing but. And so the cases collapsed overnight. And I think it could be the same with us. I think this gives us a kind of guide of how to get out of this cancel culture that we're experiencing, is if those in power start to say, your lived experience, your perception of things is all well and good. Maybe there's something to be learned from the fact you've been through this and you can talk about it, and that's fine. But it cannot be used to make a broad conclusion about the country as a whole, or as a system as a whole, or an institution as a whole. That can't be done, and it has to be disregarded in that respect. And I think that's the way, hopefully that's the way we get out of it.
Yeah, I think so. I think the implicit association test, which you're familiar with, that purports to uncover unconscious biases of all kinds, not just race, but misogyny and fatphobia and bigotry of all kinds. I remember when Malcolm Gladwell popularized that test in Blink, I think it was, where he himself took the test. He's half black. And, he said, oh my gosh, I guess I'm racist too. I didn't even know. I guess we all are. It's a kind of spectral evidence. That test has since been pretty much debunked as not only not predicting anything, it's not actually measuring what they think it's measuring, right? So, the element of truth, back to the recovered memory movement, is that there is childhood sexual molestation. That's a real thing. So of course we want to stamp that out. But then later, when we deconstructed those therapy sessions, in which the therapist, these mostly adult women, would go in for something, anxiety, depression, weight problems, sleeping problems, whatever it is. And these therapists who were kind of bought into the whole Freudian thing that, you suppress these issues and there's something underneath it. If we can tease it out, we can find the core problem. Would tell them, well, maybe you were molested as a child. No, I wasn't molested as a child. It's not that. Well, I know that's what, everybody says, but in fact, we know that you could be suppressing that, kind of repressing that, and that this is a symptom. sleep disorders or depression. Oh, I didn't know that. Now, this would go on for months before they would kind of slowly inculcate into this. Well, maybe that did happen. Yeah. Think about your dreams. Think about these kind of hidden ideas that pop up into your head, and then they'd come back week after week. I think you might be right. Something's coming out here. Right. This is the, do the witches themselves believe it? They might at some point, if they're accused, well, maybe I did do it. Like people that confess to a crime, where the cops lie to them. We have eyewitnesses, we got your fingerprints. Oh, maybe I did do it, right? So, and that feeds into the prosecutors, right? So, but back to why you why you're even making this analogy, reading from your book here of this study by the sociologist Albert Bergenson, which identifies 3 key features common to these outbreaks. First, they emerge quickly and with a sudden intensity. Second, the crimes of the supposed perpetrators are seen to threaten the collective, the nation, the people, the revolution, the state. Finally, the charges are based on minor or seemingly insignificant acts. All of these features apply to the Rowling case. Here you're talking about J.K. Rowling. Now, she's pretty much uncancelable, but is the point of attacking people like her that people that don't have billions of dollars and a legal team to defend themselves and don't have to worry about income and jobs, that's who it's really for? The cancel culture is kind of a signal?
It's an interesting question, and what I would say is I don't purport to know the minds of others. I don't know what the motives are behind it. I like to take people at their word, and I do think with a lot, like with the hysterical young girls at Salem, I do think a lot of these activists who believe that J.K. Rowling is an evil transphobe do believe it. When they say it, I think they do believe it. I mean, there's an interesting. There will be some. There's something about this new critical social justice movement or woke movement, whatever you want to call it, because it does legitimize bullying, that it will attract those, sadistic individuals, people who enjoy inflicting pain on others. It obviously will attract those types because they can do so under the guise of virtue, and that makes sense. But I also do believe that most of them do actually believe it. I mean, I make the analogy in my book. I talk about how some of the high priests of this movement will be donning the sacred robes out of a sense of duty, and others as a disguise. And I think it's a combination of both. And I think we'll get lost a bit if we try and identify the motives of each individual activist. But what we can say, I think, on a broader scale is that it's a bit of both, isn't it? It's going to be a bit of both. And I think with the J.K. Rowling case, because it's such a clear-cut case. Now, with J.K. Rowling, everything she said about this subject is out there and on record. She wrote a very long, compassionate blog post about outlining precisely what she thought about the issue of gender identity ideology and women's rights and the importance of preserving women's sex-based rights, which come from her own experiences of domestic violence. And nobody could read that and come away and think we're dealing with a hateful transphobe or even a far-right figure or fascist or whatever it is they call her. You couldn't. So those who still cling to that belief either are completely ill-informed or are captured by this fantasy and are, in other words, interpreting the world as they would like it to be, as opposed to how it is. And they are clinging to that belief in the light of evidence presented to them, which, as you know, is called belief perseverance. And it's very suggestive. It's suggestive that part of their identity now is this hatred of J.K. Rowling or hatred of TERFs generally, what they call trans-exclusionary radical feminists. It's not something they could. It's too costly on a personal level to let that go, and so they would rather cling to the fantasy. And there's nothing new about that. There's been all sorts of scenarios in human history where people will cling to comfortable fantasies rather than accept difficult truths. And I think that's happening here with Rowling. I mean, last week, in fact, J.K. Rowling, who occasionally replies to her detractors, someone had said that you regularly, attack and smear a whole community and express hatred for this whole community. And she replied and said, okay, can you show me where I've done that? Just a quote or a tweet.
Just one.
And this person replied, yeah, just one. She said, there must be loads, right? And this person replied, I haven't seen it, but I bet you did. And that, I think, is so revealing, right, isn't it? And I've been in similar back and forth with people who've accused her of transphobia. But the question that you ask about motive and about, is this a lesson for other people? Well, whether it's intentionally a lesson for other people or not, it certainly has that effect. Insofar as the viciousness, the kind of ferocity, the continual rape threats and death threats, the lies that are told about her, the misrepresentations and the smears are so intense. Most people would crumble psychologically under that. I mean, I have nothing but admiration for her because you're right. She's a billionaire, oh, not a billionaire anymore because she's given so much of her money to good causes. So actually, she's a millionaire. But this is the type of person we're dealing with. Someone who's a genuinely decent, good human being, right? And the evidence is there. But the point is that when people see what, you know, she must be a tough character to be able to take all that. But I don't think most people could. I know people who've had just one or two horrible comments online and they're distressed for the day. You know, it's a warning. You know, whether it's intentional or not, it acts as a warning, and it means that people think, okay, well, I won't say that I think that biological sex is important for the preservation of women's rights, even though it is. You know, I won't say that no human being has ever changed sex, even though they haven't. You know, I won't make these true, verifiable statements, because innocuous statements, by the way, that 99% of people know to be true, I won't do it, because look what happens to that person, that prominent public figure, when they do. And unlike her, I am cancelable, right? So, you know, J.K. Rowling can't be cancelled. Gillian Phillip, by the way, who's a children's author, who merely tweeted in support of J.K. Rowling, was dropped by her publisher straight away. She's out of the children's book writing industry. She had to retrain as a truck driver. And she now says that the haulage industry is better than the children's book industry. It's less misogynistic, okay? But that's an example where, you know, she can be cancelled because she's not J.K. Rowling. She doesn't have that money. She doesn't have the means to defend herself from the depredations of the online mob. And that's most people. Cancel culture affects the vast majority of people. Come back to what you said about Salem. It wasn't the dignitaries that got hanged. It was those with lesser means, shall we say, those who were unable to defend themselves. It's always the case. And so whenever I hear people say cancel culture is just, we're holding the powerful to account. No, you're not, because the victims of cancel culture tend to be ordinary working people who can't defend themselves in the way that someone like J.K. Rowling does. So I think it's a very grim situation. I noticed that particularly in America, there seems to be this widespread view of J.K. Rowling as some kind of demon. Am I wrong about that? Because that's not really caught on here in the UK. It's just the mad activists and some people in the media commentariat who irresponsibly perpetuate those lies as well, and they must know their lies.
Some of that might be driven by resentment of wealthy people. That's kind of a different line there. You know, that somehow if she made $1 million writing books, that, okay, Stephen King, yeah, in that kind of category, Malcolm Gladwell, yeah. But, you know, 10 million, 100 million, $1 billion, more than $1 billion because of all the film rights and all that stuff. That just feels wrong. I think there's some of that sense, just like the resentment against Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, and who are, in any case, are giving away like 90% of their money, right? So what's wrong with that? Well, it's kind of resentment against capitalism, maybe. But I was thinking about a couple other things. Like I have a different ways to respond. Like I have a friend who's a professor at UCLA. He's probably the most famous professor there, or at least in the top 10, you know, very prominent, can't be canceled, but he doesn't want anything to do with this. He keeps his mouth shut. He just avoids all of it. He just doesn't want the hassle. And, you know, his UCLA email address, he won't even put anything in an email to me. He just talks to me about it on the phone or in person. I just don't want to deal with it. It's just too, you know, distracting and upsetting and so on. So there's that. Then I was going to ask you about preemptive denunciation, which is a phenomenon in witch crazes. That is, I better denounce somebody before they denounce me. And so no one actually believes this. It's just kind of the way the social contagion operates. So maybe like in the Soviet trials, right? The show trials, well, people would accuse other people before they themselves got accused. So I do wonder if there's some of that in the cancel culture.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's the old story. Like if there's a vigilante mob and you're the murderer and there's a vigilante mob going out on the streets at night to find the murderer, you join that mob, don't you? I mean, that's the cover you require. I have absolutely no doubt there's an element to that, an element of self-preservation. I mean, when Arthur Miller wrote The Crucible in 1952, one of the reasons why he was driven to that, well, obviously the spectre of McCarthyism. It was actually. I mean, he said in an interview with the New Yorker that it was because what bothered him most was the people in power staying quiet or joining in for purposes of self-preservation, right? And I I absolutely think that that's likely to be the case. That a lot of these accusations, because that puts you on the side of the angels, doesn't it? That's the girls who are making the accusations. Were, if you've seen The Crucible, you'll know that there's the figure of Mary Warren starts to tell the truth, and then they turn on her, and she realizes very soon she's going to have to, and she accuses John Proctor ultimately, and that protects her, and that saves her, and that brings her back into the arms of the saved. Yeah, so I'm sure there's all of that going on. I think a lot of the reason why the critical social justice movement has become so dominant in Western countries is intimidation. Ultimately, people are they're scary people, right? They're really, really frightening, and ultimately they also turn on each other with such incredible ferocity that you wouldn't want to be their friends, would you? I mean, with the girls of Salem, when it all finished, they couldn't find partners, they couldn't get married, they didn't have friends. They were very powerful for a short amount of time. They were the most powerful people in the community because they could have you killed and they would be applauded for it. But you wouldn't want to be their friends. It's the same with a lot of these terrifying activists online. It's like, okay, I could be in that fold. It would be very easy. I could start writing these things that I don't believe and accusing people of all kinds of things and everything. But there's that constant fear. It's like being in the mafia. Like, you've got a degree of protection, but there might be a bullet in the back of your head any day now because they might turn on you. Is it really worth it? I think just telling the truth is a better idea, personally.
Well, then there's this phenomenon of pluralistic ignorance, or the spiral of silence, where everybody believes that everybody else believes something, even though they themselves don't. And so you end up with a minor percentage of a population believing something. It may even be a tiny percent, but everybody thinks that everybody else goes along with it. And that kind of carries it on the ether for quite a while, like Nazism, right? The majority of Germans maybe were happy with Hitler's program to get him out of the Depression, but most were not interested in going to war. And the exterminationist program, they were anti-Semitic, so they're happy to see Jews gotten rid of, I guess, out of their neighborhoods, but not the exterminationist program, right? But by then, the press is shut down. There's no way to speak out, right? So the emperor, you talk about the emperor has no clothes in your book. It's like there's nobody to say he's butt naked, right? And if they do, You'll be locked up.
But that's the real issue, isn't it? Is that I'm sure that's absolutely right. Is that the reason why gender identity ideology has spread so much is because the elites repeat the same slogans, and when people see major politicians struggling to answer the question, what is a woman? Or maybe they think, well, maybe it's not as simple as I thought it was. When you've got leading medical journals saying that sex is a spectrum, well, you tend to defer to the judgment of expertise, don't you? And although we all know that sex is not a spectrum, everyone knows that, but the leading experts in the world, the leading magazines seem to think it is. So maybe we've got it wrong. This is completely understandable stuff. And this is why this is going to be so difficult to root out, because it is so now deeply embedded in academia in particular, where you will have academics, I'm afraid, lying, just saying something they know not to be true in service to an ideology. It's a very, very dangerous position to be in, that you reach this thing which we call a legitimation crisis, because if we can't trust the figures of authority, if we can't trust the universities to fulfill their role of being, the producers of knowledge, the producers of truth, if that's gone, then where are we? We're back to the medieval period, just going along with whatever the clergy tell us to be true, because they haven't translated the Bible into the vernacular. They've kept us in ignorance, and it's and this is why I've invoked that idea of the counter Enlightenment in my book, because I think that's really what we're facing here. Was like the Enlightenment does to a degree set us free as human beings, and to go back to that kind of darkness is it's absolutely terrifying to me, actually. I think there's so much at stake here that I think we have to speak out about it. And that idea of a conspiracy, it's not so much even a conspiracy of silence, like you say, it's people doubting their own senses because they're not hearing sufficient numbers telling the truth anymore. And it has a kind of deranging effect. It's even in 1984, isn't it? When Winston Smith eventually pronounces 2 + 2 = 5, it's not even that he doesn't believe it. He does. His mind. It's not that he feels I've got to say this because otherwise they'll put me back in that that room with the rats gnawing at my face. It's because, sorry if that was a spoiler, but he does it because he actually then believes it. He's actually become he actually now thinks in the way the party wants him to think, because they've controlled the words that can be used, and by extension the thoughts that can be had. I mean, that's the whole point of the project.
Right, and therefore the importance of language that you talk about in your book as controlling people's thoughts. But one last thing on this, the reason I bring this up is because one of the pushbacks I get from talking to people like you and my own writings on the subject is, you're creating this moral panic over a very minor thing. This is just a little thing, and you're turning it into this, massive cultural war, and it's not that. And it's like a same-sex marriage. Back in the day, people said, "Oh well, if we allow gays to marry, then people will marry their animals," or something like this, right? And so we have to, you've created a moral panic like that by responding like you are. Is it possible that we're doing something like that, or how would you respond to kind of a common criticism like that?
I would say it's not just a criticism; it's a tactic. What we are doing is we are commenting on a moral panic. We are not. You do not create a moral panic by commenting on a moral panic. This is a moral panic which is going on, where people are saying there are all these fascists out there. There are, that all these gender critical feminists are conspiring with the far right. The children who are gender non-conforming need to be medically fixed. This is a moral panic, and we are commenting on that moral panic. But they will say that, it happens all the time. So, my book is a criticism of culture warriors. It is an analysis of the culture war. But they will say that you are starting a culture war by commenting upon the culture war. This is just standard stuff all the time. They will say, for instance, the word woke, which was a word that was embraced by activists in the mid-2010s, and they used it as a form of self-identification. And now, and a couple of years later, people like me started to use that word to describe them because that was their word. So I was doing that out of courtesy. And all of a sudden, no, we never described ourselves as that. This is just a snarl word invented by the right to attack us. And again, it's a tactic. It's clearly a tactic. They know that they want to revolutionize culture. They want to tear down all traditions, all values, liberal values. They want to just see destroyed freedom of speech. There is so much evidence of it, right? So the idea that we're commenting on a non-issue is one of the reasons I wrote the book, because if you look through the footnotes of my book, there are so many examples sourced of what's going on here, of examples of where culture warriors are attacking our major institutions and the ongoing project of social liberalism. The evidence is so clear. And like I say, I'm just not going to have any truck with this idea that commenting on it is the same thing as perpetuating it. It's the reverse.
A little bit like the language discussion you have about what woke actually means, because if you look at the definition, awareness of social injustices, and you feel something should be done about it. Yeah, I'm woke then, I guess. Or Black Lives Matter. Do you think Black Lives Matter? Yes, of course I do. Right? And so on. But then that's not really what those words mean, or have come to mean anyway.
Right. And that's the big problem that we face. That's why I spend so much time talking about language in the book, because really the culture war is about language. It's about who gets to define what words mean. It's also why the movement has been so successful, because it uses progressive sounding terminology. And most people are decent, right? The vast majority of people, like I say, believe that racism is a terrible thing. So when they hear activists using phrases like anti-racist, phrases like equity, and then most people don't understand that equity is different from equality, and most people support equality, so they'll go along with it. Similarly, social justice. Most people think, yeah, I mean, I'm on board with social justice. Who wouldn't be? And it's that idea. It's that strategy of using a kind of Trojan horse strategy, where you smuggle through regressive ideas using progressive language. That's exactly what's happening here. We are dealing with an illiberal, regressive movement, something that is undoing the achievements of the civil rights luminaries. A body of people who even problematize Martin Luther King, and they believe that colorblindness, the notion of the beautiful ideal of not treating people differently because of their skin color, that is a racist idea, right? So this is a backward movement, right? It's taking us the wrong way. It's not progressive. There's another one. They call themselves progressives. Well, they're the opposite. You know, they have mistaken, as I say in the book, they have mistaken progress for change. They're changing things, but they're not making things better. They're making things worse. And I think we need to, that's why in order to understand them, and it was that confusion I was trying, that's why I've written the book, because I think people are really confused. And I wanted to be able to talk through what the words these activists use, what they mean, what the actual impact of these principles are, as opposed to what they proclaim them to be. The damage that this does, with evidence, to show that this is not only the extent of the power that they have and the way in which the woke are the establishment, but also the destruction that this will do to our way of life, and is already doing. You know, taking us back to there are even now instances of racial segregation. You know, put through. You know, in London, there's a school in London called the American School, actually, but it's a London school, day school, posh, one of the poshest in the country. They were segregating kids by skin color for after-school activities. Now, if you'd have said that to anyone 15 years ago, said, "Oh yeah, progressives would have been applauding that kind of thing," people would have said, "What are you talking about?" Progressives don't applaud racial segregation; they abhor it. Well, they don't anymore, do they? And so that's why we have to be very careful when they use these terms to understand the difference between the terms that they use and the implications that those terms have, and the reality of what happens when their policies are enacted in society.
So, in the sociology of how these movements go, you don't need a majority of people, right? I mean, because most polls show the majority of people, think political correctness has gone too far, they think wokeness has gone too far, and so on and so forth. How small a minority can it be? And is it like the witch hunters? You have the most powerful, influential people. You only need a handful of them, really, to start the ball rolling. Like if some academic deans, some CEOs of corporations like Disney that want to do the right thing to help, show that they're on board with social justice and so on. And all of a sudden, again, back to the pluralistic ignorance, everybody thinks, well, everybody else must be on board with this. But it doesn't take a majority like that to make it happen.
And of course, it comes back to that question of the elites. You know, even if in Salem, the majority of villagers didn't really believe it, they all knew they couldn't speak out because they'd be the next to be accused. And also, it didn't matter because that tiny minority of powerful people were saying it is true. And therefore, the others had to go along with it. So that's always been the case. There was an interesting study in the UK recently by a group called the More in Common Initiative that found that roughly 13% of the UK population would or could be classified as woke, as in would fall into the belief system of this critical social justice movement, which actually I thought was rather a large number. I was surprised at how large that was. But like I say, I mean, I there's a chapter in my book where I talk about how the origins of this are very much from the middle classes, and particularly the upper middle classes. The most vociferous of the activists within this movement tend to have double-barreled surnames. They tend to have been privately educated. They tend to have gone to Oxford or Cambridge. They are from very plummy, privileged backgrounds on the whole. Oh, it makes sense because, if you're living on a council estate and you're working two jobs and you can't afford to feed your kids, you're not going to care about people's gender-neutral pronouns. You have more in life, more priorities in life. So I think this is a middle-class movement, a bourgeois movement, and that's kind of inevitable because it was fermented in academe. And I think, it's only relatively recently within my lifetime where the majority of people go to university. Certainly in my parents' generation, it was a very, very rare thing for people to go to university. And it was often the richer people who were able to do that. So, I think that's why it has come. That's why, for all their talk of privilege, I mean, this is perhaps why they don't focus on class privilege, or they rarely do. Their focus is race, gender, sexuality, that holy trinity. Class is difficult for them because why would they want to problematize a situation that works to their advantage?
Mm-hmm. Right, yes. I also wonder to what extent even people that publicly state it actually believe it. Did the executives at Disney use that example that Ron DeSantis pushed back against in Florida? Do they really believe this, or the Starbucks executives? Okay, we're going to put all our employees through this training program because of this incident at this one store. Or are they just like thinking, well, look, for the bottom line, we better, be on board here?
In other words, do they believe that when Robin DiAngelo goes into a Coca-Cola and instructs the members of staff to try to be less white.
Right.
Do the people believe that? I mean, or are they secretly just laughing their heads off at it? You know, I mean,
we don't know.
Well, I think it's more to do with that. I mean, I mention it in the book, and I mentioned it in my last book, the economist Tim O'Curran's idea of preference falsification, which with this idea that what you end up saying is what you believe to be the popular view, or what you believe to be the view that you should say, but not the opinion you actually hold. I had a friend of mine who was on a BBC panel show with a number of experts, and they all made their points, and they got their rounds of applause from the audience for making their points. And afterwards, apparently, in the green room, they were all talking about the topic, and they all said, "Yeah, I didn't really believe that. Did you?" And no. And they all realised that none of them really believed it, but they'd all said it, and they'd all got the necessary rounds of applause, which I guess was why they're there if it's about ego. But you know that, yeah. This idea of preference falsification, I think, is really, really interesting. And we can all associate with it because we've all been teenagers. So we know what that's like. You've always been, you know, I mean, I can only speak from my own experience, I suppose, but I know that people genuinely, mostly teenagers experience it when you're in a group of people and you've got an opinion that's different from what the others seem to be expressing, and you just don't say it. You say what they think. You know, when I was a boy, I didn't support a football team. All the other boys, not only my class, but my school, did. So I just pretended to support a football team, and I found a name of a football team in the paper, and I said I supported that.
That's funny.
That's preference falsification, right?
Right.
And I think when we grow older and become more intellectually curious, and then you break through that. But there's something about the climate that is being developed at the moment that will inevitably result in preference falsification because the Overton window is being depleted to such an extent, because people are being so demonized and attacked for expressing a different point of view. Why would you? Why wouldn't you just wait, sit back and think, okay, what's the safe opinion for me to express, and do that? And I think that's such a tragedy. You know, when I was at university, there was a real joy to getting drunk late at night with university friends and disagreeing and challenging each other. We loved it. We would even playing devil's advocate sometimes, just having the debate. And well, sometimes I suppose people threw a drink and stormed out, but that was a rare thing. Most of the time, it was a fun thing to do. And then you know, and that I don't see that happening. This sort of intense conformity now. It's a kind of intellectual death, and and that's why I think people just need to be braver and say what they think, even if it's the unpopular view. Risk getting the drink in the face, because ultimately your life's going to be richer as a result.
Another thought I had reading the new Puritans. What is this? What are we talking about here? Well, humans have a moralistic impulse. You know, we have a sense of right and wrong. We want to correct injustices. We want fairness, and so on. So much moral progress has been made over the last several centuries: the abolition of slavery and torture, and women's rights, you know, civil rights, gay rights, same-sex marriage, 2015. Oh my gosh, you know, we've just gone so far. Maybe, you know, students today or younger people or whatever feel like, well, I want to do something. I want to make something right. And then they see something like the George Floyd killing, you know, which everybody was outraged by, and legitimately so. I want to do something. Okay, what can I do? Well, this is the example I use is like, what can I do? I'm not a police chief. I'm not the mayor of the town. I can't pass legislation. I don't know. But I'll go down because there's a march tomorrow afternoon. I'm going down there and I'm going to have my voice heard. Or I'm going to go online and I'm going to denounce somebody on Twitter or whatever. Then it kind of makes me feel like, well, I'm doing something finally. So I do wonder to what extent your new Puritans are a little bit of that. Like, you know, just kind of a natural impulse. I want to, there's still, as you point out in the book, you know, there's never going to be zero asshole racists and misogynists. So there'll always be some. And on social media, you can probably track them by the hour, even if it's, you know, 0.01% of the population are like this. That's enough to engage people to, you know, kind of get out there and do this.
Yeah, and as I say, I think it's completely understandable that people would have that impulse, because I think most people are decent people, and there is something, you know, very rewarding about feeling like you've done something to better society. That's what we all want to do. Ultimately, we all want to leave the world a better place than when we found it. And so I have complete sympathy for that point of view. And I think a lot of these cases, and I continually make this point in the book about how I'm reiterating this idea that I don't see this as a war in as far as these are my enemies and I must crush them. I see these as well-intentioned, largely well-intentioned people who are trying to do good. And that the book is largely aimed at those people. It's saying, look, think about what you're doing, consider it. It's the excesses of moral purity, that can lead to some terrible situations throughout history. It's always happened. And I think we need to be watchful of it. But absolutely, I think that impulse to do good is behind an awful lot of this. I would say most of it. But that also makes it harder to fight, doesn't it? Because suddenly, if you're challenging them, you're on the side of the fascists and the racists and all the rest of that. Or that's their perception, isn't it? And of course, you're not. I mean, it's like when you defend free speech. It's like the defense of free speech also, of course, entails the defense of horrible people to say horrible things. But that doesn't mean that you support the things they say. And it's that fundamental misunderstanding that it's going to make this very difficult to push back on, because if it were the case that the woke, or whatever you want to call them, the identitarians, whatever you want to call them, or whatever they want to call themselves, if they knew what they were doing was wrong, if they knew what they were doing was damaging to humanity and to society, it would be easier in a way. But they think what they're doing is right and good, and even though the evidence seems to suggest they're making society more racially divided, and the rift in the LGBTQIA plus community now is reaching fever pitch. Things are not getting better, and I guess maybe in 10 years' time that will be far more obvious. But how do we reach? I mean, we could only have reached this point through good intentions. We could only have done so because the idea that young gay kids should be medicalized, fixed, heterosexualized, and that is a thing that progressives are supporting. That's not something that any of us could have envisaged 15, 20 years ago. We have a place in London called the Tavistock Clinic, which is a gender pediatric clinic for kids, which has recently been shut down because finally there's been a report that has realized that the vast majority of their patients are just gay. They're just gay, and they're finding it difficult to deal with. Or they're autistic. There's a high level of autism within those kids who feel have some kind of struggle with their gender identity. And so you are effectively having state-sanctioned conversion therapy of gay kids, and medical intervention, mutilation even. There are people who lost their genitals, had their breasts removed. This is horrible, grisly stuff. And there will be a minority of those kids who do grow up to experience gender dysphoria to such an extent that they feel they have to have surgery or present as the opposite sex in order to be happy. And they deserve support and compassion and the same rights as absolutely everyone else. But transing kids who are predominantly simply gender non-conforming, based on a reactionary, old-fashioned, conservative view of gender stereotypes, is not progressive. It's about as far as from progressive as it gets. Now, convincing people that is very difficult because people don't understand it, and people are worried about getting caught out again. They don't want to be on the wrong side of history. They don't want to look like the people who didn't support gay marriage 15 years ago. They don't want to look like the homophobes of the past. So again, a lot of it's really, really well intentioned, but it's not good to sterilize gay kids.
No. When I first heard Andrew Sullivan make this point, since he's a gay guy, he can make it, that telling young boys who feel like they're attracted to other boys, you're not actually attracted to boys, you're straight, you're just in the wrong body, so we need to fix your body. That's actually homophobic, right? So maybe one solution is just to reverse the vector there, to say, no, that's actually a bigoted thing to do.
Well, yeah, I mean, it you see, homophobic implies intent, doesn't it? It implies they're changing these kids because they don't like gay people. Now, there's a lot of this, and a lot of the evidence that came out of the Tavistock inquiry showed that a lot of the parents who are bringing their kids along, that a lot of that was driven by a discomfort with having a gay child, right? there's a documentary called Transgender Kids Who Knows Best, which I quote in my book, where there's an American couple who are interviewed about their child. And the father says, I'm paraphrasing here, but the father says something like, oh, it was great because I could look at my girl running. I've got a daughter running rather than my little boy prancing about, in a girly way. And obviously there's whether it's homophobia or not, there's a discomfort with the idea about having a gay child at the heart of that. At the Tavistock Clinic, there was a dark joke among the people who worked there. They used to say, soon there will be no gay people left.
Right.
So they knew what was going on here. And it isn't just the case. It isn't just about attraction. It isn't just about a boy being attracted to another boy. It's about a boy who likes to wear dresses, or a boy who likes to play with dolls, or a girl who likes to play football, or a girl who wants short hair. And all of these things are interpreted as, well, maybe you're in the wrong body. Now, that is rooted in old-fashioned gender stereotypes. That's all it is. And I think, and as well, studies are absolutely unequivocal about this. The studies show that those kind of behaviours, boys playing with dolls, girls cutting their hair short, and playing with trucks, that's a really, really reliable predictor of homosexuality in later life. It's not exact, obviously. It's absolutely not exact. A boy who wears dresses might go on to be straight. Most times they don't. In the vast majority of cases, these kids turn out to be gay. So it's far too dangerous to put people onto puberty blockers, fast track them onto medical intervention, and we're seeing the consequences now. I mean, there's up to 1,000 families who are preparing lawsuits against the Tavistock. This is going to explode. There are more and more people who are detransitioning, coming out and saying, look, I've been mutilated because when I went to this clinic, instead of saying, let's talk about it, let's talk through your issues, let's work out what's going on here, I was just affirmed. They just said, okay, if you feel you're in the wrong body, then you are. And here, have the puberty blockers. Let's move on to the next step. So that it's, again, it goes back to what you were saying earlier about the law. It might be the law that changes this. It might be lawsuits that ultimately, but there's going to be a lot of casualties. This is going to be a major medical scandal that is, it's going to go down in the history books. But I don't know. Of course, I don't know anything. But future generations, I assume, are going to be like, how the hell did that happen? How did they do that to their kids? It's incredible. But you need that kind of objectivity to be able to see what's going on.
Yeah. I had Helen Joyce on the show. She thinks you guys are turning it around in time in the UK, and it's not going to be in time in the US. I hope she's wrong about that. I hope, because we're so litigious here, maybe that could do it.
Yeah, that's what I mean. I was going to say you're a very litigious society, and I think when it comes to your kids, who wouldn't be? I think this could be the thing that breaks the critical social justice movement ultimately, because, like I say in the book, it's not just about gender identity. There are strands to do with race and all forms of group identity, and it's a kind of I describe it as a hydra with many heads. There's many of these interdependent strands, and I think the kids thing, once you've mutilated people's kids, that's not going to be forgiven, and I think that's where people are going to start pushing back, and the fantasy is going to break, and the hysteria will end, and people will look back and think, blimey, what was all that about? And I think that's I hope anyway, because the alternative is pretty grisly.
Yes, well, in the 90s, during the recovered memory movement, it wasn't clear how it was going to end, because I was publishing in the middle of that, and then it finally came to an end, and now people look back on that same thing with the 1980s satanic panic. Yeah, just a side note on the being in the wrong body. This is a kind of a throwback to dark Cartesian dualism, as if there's a you and your body. You are your body. Right. There's no right or wrong body. You that's who you are, right? So I guess
not if you believe in a soul. Not if you believe in a soul.
Yeah. Right.
And that is why this is a pseudo-religious movement, because they believe in a gendered soul. But what is confusing about this gendered soul is it is innate on the one hand, and also completely fluid and flexible on the other. Well, if it's fluid and flexible, why are you changing people's bodies then? It's a completely incoherent religious philosophy, But yes, it comes down to the idea of a soul. Absolutely. In fact, there was a tribunal recently which related to these ideas about a woman who had been fired for expressing gender critical views, and her employer in that tribunal, because of course, you know how gender ideologues always say we don't debate. We're not going to justify our points of view. In court, they had to. And so it was a fascinating insight into their way of thinking. When it got down to it, and they were asked about gender identity, this man said, "But without identity, there's just a corpse." And I think that's pretty chilling. He's talking about souls. That's what he means.
That is still dualism, right? Yeah, I wrote that essay, What is a Woman Anyway? Kind of triggered by Matt Walsh's film, but it isn't really a review of his film. Just that concept, what is the family resemblance of characteristics that we call this thing here in this box? And, it was clear when he was interviewing some of these gender surgeons and psychiatrists, is they all said it's whatever you feel like inside. You could be a body with a penis and feel like a woman and say you're a woman and we'll treat you like a woman. All right, then what do you have to cut off your dick for then? Just keep it.
Right.
There was a guy on the cover of New York who had both. He's got a vagina and a vulva, and he described his penis, his artificial penis, constructed out of his thigh skin, resting on his vulva. It's like, why do you need to do that if you can be whatever you want to be, regardless of your body parts?
Absolutely. I mean, I take the liberal view on this insofar as I do believe that people could do whatever they want with their own body once they're in adulthood. I must stress.
Yes.
I do believe that they should, we should all have the right to do that. And there are people who I've known who could not live a life until they've transitioned, until they've gone through that surgery or present in whatever way they need to present. And that I don't want to denigrate that. And I don't want to trivialize that because it's not easy either. The pain of these surgical procedures, living that life is not an easy life. And I think it's very important to remember that human element to all of this.
Absolutely. But the point is that then apparently biology and the physical makeup of your body does matter.
Yes, well, but this is why it's really important, I think, to talk about these issues, and particularly when it comes to young children, for them to understand that there is you don't have a gendered soul. You don't have that. That isn't the case. We seem to be pushing these old-fashioned gender stereotypes on kids, which lead them to feel uncomfortable in their body. That's part of the problem here. But that idea that you've said, that we don't have a body, we are our body. That's what they need to. That's what young people need to understand, and it might solve an awful lot if we could do that.
Yeah. Well, that'll change coming down the road. The problem with the language that you talk about in the book is that it's changing so rapidly, right? So if you define a woman as a body that makes gametes that are eggs that are large, or a male is a body that makes small sperm cells, those are small gametes, that's a male. It's a pretty simple biological definition. So when somebody says a man can get pregnant or whatever, okay, what do you mean by these words then? I mean, how should we redefine the words?
It's circular. It's like if you say, well, you're a woman if you feel like a woman, you have to ask the next question, which is, what is a woman? What is it that you feel like? What's your frame of reference? And they can never, these ideologues can never answer that. And ultimately, when you push them and push them and push them, it comes down to gender stereotypes. It comes down to, well, I like to play with dolls, or I like to wear dresses, or I like tilting my head coquettishly. whatever the stereotype is that a lot of these people enact, that's what it comes down to. Ultimately, that's what it comes down to. And of course, the feminist project has been for many years to demolish gender stereotypes. And of course, I think there are limits to that as well, because I think a lot of gendered behavior has got a biological origin as well. I think gender is a very complex relationship between biology and socialization. I think it's both. I don't think you can say that it is entire. There's the obvious social constructs. Boys don't inherently wear blue or want to wear blue, and girls don't inherently want to wear pink. That's clearly a cultural construct. But the idea of rough and tumble play, that boys will be more aggressive, for instance, that's biological. That's to do with evolutionary science, which I don't understand. But it's not simply that when a boy cries when he's young, the parents say, man up, don't cry, and they don't do that to girls. Although that is true, and that will have an effect, and it means boys will cry less. Okay, that's all true. but there's a reason why boys and girls behave differently, broadly, without, with obviously with the caveat that there are always going to be exceptions to that. So I think a misunderstanding of gender, which is such a complex idea. It's neither one thing nor the other. It's not a wholly a social construct, but nor is it wholly biological. It's that combination.
Right. So sex is binary in the biological sense, although not perfectly so, right? Because there's these intersect cases, vanishingly small, some tiny, tiny fraction of 1%. But the sense I get amongst activists is that
which don't disprove the binary, though, of course.
Right. That's right.
Yeah.
But the sense I get is that if we can make the number bigger, then people will be more inclined to accept them as normal and therefore grant them rights and more respect and so on. I'm a John Stuart Mill kind of liberal. All mankind minus one, his famous phrase. It wouldn't matter if there's just one trans person on the entire planet. They should have the same rights as everybody else, right? But that's what I think is partly behind it. Like if we can increase the numbers, there's way more trans. Where it's not a fraction of 1%. It's 1%, 10%, whatever. It's some huge number. Therefore, they should be taken seriously.
I mean, that's interesting, but again, we're back to motive, aren't we? We're back to people. Yes. I mean, maybe that's true, but I'm always wary of I can speculate, and that's all I can do. I maybe some people do. I mean, certainly, let's try and root it in something. I mean, if you take the gay rights movement, right? There was a time during the gay rights movement where gay people would claim all sorts of historical figures as gay in order to normalize it, and sometimes that was true. So for instance, someone like Christopher Marlowe was probably gay. I mean, there seems to be sufficient evidence to suggest that. Certainly someone like James I, there's definitely evidence there. You've got love letters even in his case, and accounts of him kissing his boyfriends at court and things like that. Francis Bacon, definitely evidence with him. But Shakespeare, well, he was one of the few poets to write love sonnets to another man quite openly. There's that, but of course, artists aren't always telling the truth in what they write. But it's possible. We don't know is the question. But there's a moment in Larry Kramer's novel Faggots. I don't know if you know this novel, where Larry Kramer, who wrote the play The Normal Heart, he wrote this novel called Faggots, in which there is he satirizes this. There's a moment where he talks about all these various queers from history and he all these gay men, and he starts throwing all sorts of names in there that people who were just speculatively gay, but people like Richard the Lionheart, who may have been gay, but and there was a certain pride in that. Now, you do see a similar thing with the current trans movement in this weird revisionist, where they try and claim people from the past as being trans in order to promote this historical continuity and to say that we've always been here and there've always been more of us than you think. And they've even brought in people like the people who began the Stonewall riots and say that was started by black trans people, and that's not true. That's not true. It was gay men and lesbians who started that. And the records. What's weird about that as well is it's not that long ago, and the records are easily verifiable. They even sort of invoke people like Martha P. Johnson and say Martha P. Johnson was trans. Martha P. Johnson was a gay man, was a drag act. Said so himself. So it's very strange that these people are invoked and transed. You get this with James Miranda Barry, the doctor, who presented as male, largely because it was a male industry. You couldn't be a doctor as but the idea that means that James Miranda Barry was trans it's not true. We've had it recently in London where there's a play in London at the Globe Theatre, which is the reconstructed Shakespearean theatre on the South Bank, and the play is about Joan of Arc. And it's called I, Joan, and it's a modern play. And of course, you can do whatever you want with a play. You can reimagine historical figures however you want. That's an artistic choice. But this playwright, who identifies as non-binary, has decided that Joan of Arc will be presented as non-binary using they/them pronouns. On the poster, Joan of Arc is wearing a breast binder or something that resembles a breast binder.
I saw that. Yeah.
Now the thing about that is, like I say, I defend her artistic freedom to present Joan of Arc however she sees fit. Shakespeare presented Joan of Arc as a sexually promiscuous, devil-worshipping, violent psychopath, right? So, that's fine. That's in Henry VI, Part 3. And you can do that. But what was interesting is the academics who wrote the supportive material for the play, right, which you can see on the Globe Theatre's website, were talking about things like Queen Elizabeth was probably non-binary, because Queen Elizabeth, you remember Queen Elizabeth's famous speech of I may have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart of a man, and even uses them pronouns for Queen Elizabeth, themself for Queen Elizabeth. No, Queen Elizabeth was a woman. And there's something weird, and feminists have pointed out this, and I think they're onto something here. There's a weird thing of suggesting that any woman in history, like Joan of Arc, who had traditionally masculine characteristics such as courage, independence, strength, leadership, devotion, integrity, etc., couldn't have been a woman. They had all these parts. So let's say they were non-binary. Let's say that there's something. I mean, feminists are suggesting there's a kind of underpinned misogyny to all this, and they may be onto something there. I mean, again, that's into the realms of speculation. I don't know, but it feels that way, doesn't it? I mean, why can't you have a strong, independent woman? Why can't you have a Joan of Arc kick-ass girl who took on the English and fought in full armor? And one of the reasons, by the way, that she dressed as a man, well, it was short hair and armor, is because of the threat of rape, of course, if you were captured, right? So this doesn't mean that she was non-binary. She was a woman. And like I say, the theatre or the writer are perfectly entitled to present her however they want. Absolutely. But the idea of non-binary to Joan of Arc would have been incoherent. She hit just a matter of historical fact that would not have made sense to her, So, and I think, and also I worry about that because I don't worry about it, but I kind of think it's really banal, because this is the establishment way of thinking at the moment. The theatre industry is particularly captured by this ideology. Actor friends of mine, whenever they're in rehearsals, have to pronounce their pronouns at the start of rehearsals. It's really deeply embedded into the theatre industry. So to do a play where you make a historical figure non-binary, that's not radical. It has the pretensions of radicalism. It's actually super conformist within that industry. And that is boring art. Now, look, I haven't seen the show. It might be brilliant. I might go along and love it. And I'm making all kinds of assumptions here. What I'm saying is the premise does not excite me in the way that, as I mentioned in the book, when they used to do these kind of playing with identity 30 years ago, 40 years ago, that was exciting and radical. When Francis de la Tour played Hamlet, that was exciting and radical. When The Wiz first appeared on Broadway, that's exciting and radical. An all-black Wizard of Oz, that would have been exhilarating to see, and against the establishment and different and shocking. An all-black version of Annie now, say, would just be boring, because that's what all of the major establishments are pushing for, and all that. It would have no radicalism, nothing exhilarating about it. And so that's I don't know. I'm rambling now, aren't I? Sorry, but I did have a point.
No, that's okay.
In the midst of that ramble,
it reminds me of there was a big book in a three-volume book in the 1990s called Black Athena. It was by a black scholar who argued that the Greeks got their philosophy and therefore Western civilization and so on from the Egyptians, because Plato visited Egypt or whatever, and the Egyptians are in Africa and Africans are black, and therefore, white Western civ got its culture from black Africans. Okay. Anyway, so Mary Lefkowitz who's a classicist, wrote a critique of this saying, asking what color Egyptians are is a very late 20th century American thing to do. Egyptians would not have been thinking of themselves, well, we're not black, we're not white, we're red, whatever. That would not have been something that is part of their culture. So if you ask Joan of Arc, what are your pronouns or whatever, she'd probably be like, what are you talking about?
Yeah. Well, exactly. It's this thing of like, well, look, artists always sort of treat the past with their own obsessions. I mean, even Miller writing The Crucible wasn't really talking about Salem. He was talking about McCarthyism, and there's something quite interesting about that. And I'm all for that. It's fine. It worries me more when historians do it, and that's something which is happening more and more now, such as the 1619 project. The fact checkers of that were even saying, hang on a minute, where you revise history. This is why it bothers me when trans activists revise the history of the Stonewall riots. And so, and they say that, and that has seeped into the popular discourse where people say, I've often had people online say to me, well, it was black trans people that started that fought for gay rights and secured your rights. It's like, no, that's not true. It's just not true. And by the way, go and read a book about Stonewall. Go and look at the photos And you'd know straight away it's not true. So, but the revision of history for present day political purposes is not the same as an artist playing with history for artistic reasons. It's not the same, and it's a bit more dangerous. I don't mind the silly play about Joan of Arc being non-binary. I do mind the academic writing an essay saying Joan of Arc was probably non-binary that accompanies the play. Do you see the distinction I'm making there?
Yes. Oh, yeah. I've seen that with autism recently, that, first of all, changing the word to, cognitive diversity. Okay. These are people that think differently. And then a kind of a parade of famous inventors, scientists, engineers, so on, technologists, who were thinking out of the box because they're autistic. And, then they cite Elon Musk. Well, Elon famously said, I'm on the spectrum. He went on Saturday Night Live and said, I'm the first autistic host of Saturday Night Live that we know of. Right. And so, that's entirely possible. Whatever euphemism you want to use, Pinker calls that the euphemism treadmill. We just sort of go through these terms. Autistic, okay, maybe that's problematic, so we use cognitive diversity, okay, whatever. But again, it's that push, like, well, if Elon is autistic, and if this guy in the past, whoever, Thomas Edison, just the parade of that, so it's not so abnormal. It's not a disease, it's not a disorder, it's part of the spectrum of human cognitive ability, and we should celebrate it.
No, that's absolutely the idea. Again, the intention is good, but when it comes to history, you shouldn't be as a historian, you shouldn't be interpreting the past to satisfy your own agenda, because otherwise it's not history, it's just wishful thinking. And I think the role of the historian is not to morally judge, to indulge in what they call presentism. It's about a dispassionate analysis of what went on. You're dealing in the facts, not, it would be like a historian getting rid of evidence that doesn't support their thesis. It's the same as the scientific method. You try and disprove yourself. And if something comes up that you didn't think of, I mentioned the anecdote from Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, in my book, because I think it really encapsulates the beauty of the scientific method. It's while he was an undergraduate at Oxford, and he writes about a visiting speaker who talked about this thing called the Golgi apparatus. Now, I don't know anything about science or biology, but apparently this is a tiny, small organelle that this academic had for years said and taught didn't exist. This visiting speaker proved in this speech that it did exist, and at the end he shook his hand and said, "Thank you, I've been wrong this past 15 years." And everyone applauded. And it's the ideal, isn't it? It's like, even when he was so invested in this thing not existing, and he'd staked his reputation, and it was so tied to his identity as a learned man, as a scholar, and he was happy to be proven wrong. And that is such an ideal. When the problem with so many of these arguments that we get into in the culture wars is with the J.K. Rowling is transphobic thing, and when you prove that she's never said anything transphobic, an adult should be able to say, well, okay, I'm wrong. The evidence isn't there. I've been wrong. And thank you for proving me wrong, because now I won't keep saying something that isn't true. And that's really to do with socialization. I think that's to do with how we are with our kids and how we educate kids. Because if I say something that is factually wrong, as I have done, and someone comes along and says this is wrong, it happened to me last year. I can't remember what it was. Something I said in an article was wrong. I got it from a source that wasn't accurate, and someone pointed it out, and it was uncomfortable, because I'm like, I've just published an article in which I've said something that isn't true. That's not a nice feeling. You feel a bit of a fool, but I still thanked them for it, and I still went and corrected the article, and I think, because otherwise I would have carried on saying the wrong thing, making a fool of myself. Why wouldn't you be grateful to be proven wrong? Why? But it's so, it's, there've been studies into this, it's not my field of expertise at all, but there have been studies into the way in which people take disagreement as a form of physical assault, almost like a personal slight. You'll know a lot more about that than I do.
Well, so a couple books.
But that seems to be the problem.
Steve Pinker's latest book, Rationality, Jonathan Rauch's book, The Constitution of Knowledge, make this point that we need to return the norms, or at least get the norms shifted toward truth-telling and honesty and open-mindedness and being willing to change your mind. Julie Galef makes this point. Her book is called The Scout Mindset as opposed to the soldier mindset. The soldier mindset is, this is a battle. My goal is to win. Like a lawyer, right? A lawyer's job is to, make your case. To the point, Chris Rock has a funny riff about this where one of his friends said something, I'm in trouble with the law and I should get a lawyer. And Rock said, you should hire Johnny Cochran, OJ's famous attorney.
Yeah.
This is back in the day. And the guy said, yeah, but then people will think I'm guilty like OJ. He goes, yeah, but you get to go home. Right. You want to hire the guy that's going to win the case, right? And Jonathan Haidt makes this point that our brains are more like lawyers than scientists. We want to win. That's it. And so those norms are hard to really get people to accept.
Yeah. I mean, I get it because we all feel it. When you're in a debate on Twitter, you're conscious that you're being watched. You're conscious that this is a public brawl. And we all have to be mindful of our own egos because we all have a sizable ego. But then whenever I'm in a debate like that online and I sense myself allowing my ego to take over, I'll get out of it pretty quickly because I just don't think that's helpful at all. I think just having an awareness of it is helpful and not denying that it exists because of course we want to win. Of course we do because we're status seeking primates, aren't we? But how about the truth? That's why we have education, socialization, civilization. Those are the things that defend us from our baser instincts, right?
Mm-hmm. If you don't mind me pushing the intention arrow a little bit more, so you make the analogy of religion, and we're ever more shifting toward a secular, nuns is the most fastest growing religion. People have no religious affiliation. To what extent do you think the social justice movement is a kind of secular religion? In the sense, again, that we want to moralize, we want to make the world a better place. These are our doctrines. This is what we stand for. And then there's no Godhead per se, but you don't have to have a Godhead.
I'm really interested in that idea and this whole debate about where as the dominance of Christianity withdraws in the West, what takes its place, and is there something innate about us? Is there a need to morally judge others or to seek kind of moral purity, or is this new ideology just filling the God-shaped hole left behind from the rise of secularism? I'm very fascinated by that. Tom Holland wrote a book called Dominion, which is a history of Christianity, and he talks in that about how effectively the woke movement kind of it's actually birthed from that Christian background. Insofar as Christianity was a movement that had as its figurehead the victim. It's the triumph of the victim, of the crucified man. That's what. And within the woke, you have the same thing. It's the triumph of the underdogs, the people who are oppressed. But through that, they consolidate power, and that's really, and so there is something in this. I'm very, very interested about whether this is anthropologically about a human need, and it is an inevitable manifestation in the wake of the withdrawal of religion. What Matthew Arnold wrote about in Dover Beach, the long withdrawing roar. I think he describes it as of institutional religion, where that leaves us, and that is fascinating. But I don't know the answer. Is what I'm going to say. Nor do I attempt in this book to find the answer.
Yeah. But you do hint at it and got me thinking about that. In the 30 plus years I've been doing this, there's always been this debate in humanist, atheist, skeptic circles. Do we need to replace religion? If we talk people out of their religious beliefs to show that it's superstition and it's supernatural and we're naturalists and so on, do we need to replace it with something? Well, a lot of us don't really care to replace it because we weren't interested in going to church in the first place. But a lot of humanists are, say, Unitarian Universalists, for example. They have Sunday meetings. They sing psalms. They light candles. They pay tribute to Newton and whoever, And it's like a church meeting. I've been to a bunch of these. It didn't do much for me, but I get that a lot of people need that. But, Pinker makes the point that we have a sexual impulse does not mean we need Playboy clubs in every city, right? You can express it many different ways. And maybe religion was just the first on the block, so you have churches in every city. But maybe we don't need that. Maybe it could be channeled into other ways. So you've documented one way, social justice, but maybe there's a bunch of other ways.
Well, exactly. Maybe what we can say is that anything done to excess is clearly bad, right? And I think, religion of a certain kind, you know, when it becomes the Westboro Baptist Church, then we can say, okay, that's when it's bad, right? That's when it's gone to excess. But actually, the vast majority of Christians you talk to, they're just nice people, aren't they? They're just nicer people because because at the heart of their belief system is treating your neighbor as you treat yourself. It's a good creed, you know. It's so I think it's to do with purpose, isn't it? And I think one thing I can say must be true is that we all have a need for meaning in this world. You know, that's, you know, why else would Jordan Peterson's work have become so successful? People are desperate for meaning, and they know that the pure scientific method or pure science, that's not enough for us. We need something that is. This is why I think art is so important. I think we need some sense of the numinous. I think it's so important to what it means to be a human being, and that's why I worry, because this current social justice movement cannot handle the arts. It's really bad for the arts because everything ends up looking the same. It becomes propaganda rather than art. And I know Orwell thought that all art was propaganda, but I don't think he was right.
You had that analogy in the book of like an orchestra that had, you know, 5 instruments all playing the same note. It's not music.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And you know, when you go and see a work of art, when you see the original Michelangelo's David, and you sense something about it which is transcendent, in a way that actually when you see the replica in the Piazza della Signoria, the square of the David, you don't quite get that feeling. You know, you should, because it's identical, but there's something about the soul of that piece, and there's something really interesting about transcendental art that takes you beyond yourself, art that, you know, and there are some artworks that just have that, but for the social justice body, what they believe is, okay, whose privilege does that artwork uphold? You know, that's how they see it. You know, is this working in the interests of the marginalized, or is it merely upholding the privileged? Raphael is just a dead white male upholding the privilege of other dead white males, straight white males, whatever. When you reduce art to that kind of analysis, to that kind of identitarian analysis, it means you can't see it for what it is. You are missing what is beautiful about it. You are denuding it of all of its power. This is why I've always resented the deconstructive approach in literature, which of course was what everyone was being taught when I was an undergraduate. That's how you got the top marks. You didn't read a poem and sort of talk about the poeticism or the artistry. You talked about whether the author was homophobic or not, and found evidence for it in the text, and you'd get a first, right? It was really that cynical. But I left university thinking I've missed so much by doing that. I mean, I got the first, but I would have had a more satisfying educational experience had I not listened to the academics who were telling me to work in that way. And of course, this is why it troubles me with the idea of destroying works of art that don't satisfy contemporary moral trends. You know, I mentioned in the book the school board in Ottawa that burned thousands of books across 30 different schools, burned the books because they had outdated racial stereotypes, burned the books and called it a flame purification ceremony. I mean, my God, it sounds like something a satirist would make up, you know, and then they planted a tree using the ashes from the burned books. Look, the mind boggles. But what do you... Oh, absolutely horrendous. And so what do you do with that? Well, I mean, there are so many problematic artists. This idea of... I've got the chapter in the book about this, is that why do we... It's all very well debating about them. I mean, characters, for one, the characters in art, in fiction, can often be morally ambiguous, and that's part of the point. But we're now expecting characters to be morally pure. You know, I know I've got a friend who's a novelist. He's had to leave his publisher because they kept intervening and saying that even his villains they couldn't say racist things, or they couldn't say problematic things. They're villains. Or maybe they're not villains, but maybe they're morally ambiguous, which is part of, you know, and that's what I mean, is that if you surrender to this ideology, you can't... Art is what suffers. Creativity is what suffers. What happens when this spreads to Italy? What happens when they go after Cellini, whose statue of Perseus is one of my favourite sculptures, and that's there in the square in the middle of Florence in the Piazza della Signoria. What happens when they go after him? Because he was involved with sexual activity with underage people. He murdered people. This is not a nice guy, right? This is not a good guy. If you don't believe me, read his autobiography, which is really fascinating, by the way, and a great read. But do they want to tear that statue down? Do they want? Well, in their mindset, they would, because it's perpetuating the sins of the artist. It's perfectly possible to condemn the way someone behaves and love their art. The two are separate things, and it really worries me that we're going down that road.
Oh yeah, I love that you brought up the example of John Wayne in your book, because I remember when that happened, when that he was disinterred, that Playboy interview he gave in whenever that was, early 60s.
That's it.
Using the language that guys born whenever he was born, 1920 something, would talk about Jews and blacks and Indians and women and so on. A little bit like, remember Sean Connery gave that interview with Barbara Walters, where he said something about you just slap them and shack them, talking about women, and she's like,
I remember.
Did you just say what I think you said? But he's an old guy.
Well, that was shocking for the time.
yeah.
But that's right. I mean, but and it's perfectly possible to say I really disapprove of that. That's one thing. It's a step beyond that to say let's remake his films and erase his image from the films. Can't people see the difference here? I mean, that's what they literally did, didn't they? To what was the film with Kevin Spacey? They took him out and refilmed it with Christopher Plummer.
Oh, right. Yeah.
I can't remember what it was called now.
Yes, right.
Those kind of revisionist things really, really trouble me, because, the Western canon is built on some pretty dodgy folk. Some people who did some pretty dodgy things that maybe in their time weren't dodgy, or maybe in their time were, right? I mean, Cellini was under house arrest when he wrote his autobiography. That's why he was able to write it, because he was such a wrong 'un. So but I just think we have to. I mean, like I say, it's. I worry about what this does to the arts, because I think the arts do. When you reach the highest forms of art, it does give us purpose, and does give us meaning, and it does make life worthwhile. It's not about power structures.
Yes, since you brought up Jordan Peterson, it's interesting that he's hard to pin down on his religion. Is he a Christian? Does he really believe in God? If you ask him, of course, he'll go on for hours. What do you mean by God? What do you mean by believe? And mythology and so on. And before you know it, 3 hours later, he's still talking. Wow. Okay. But the appeal is not that he's religious at all, or he's religious in some broader sense of purpose and meaning and structure to life is good. And that's one thing that religion can do for people. So why not pull back and look at the kind of the broader structure, such that even if religion falls into disuse and it's replaced by something else, it could be some bad things, could be some good things, it could be a lot of different things, and that kind of deeper structure is what's important. Okay, last final point here, bringing into the fifth set, shall we say, of you talk about postmodernism, and postmodernism made some good points, started off well, right? Like let's not just accept whatever the dogma of the day is. Let's be skeptical. It's kind of a skeptical movement. That again goes too far. So to what extent, what you're writing about, the New Puritans, social justice movement, let's call it, is a derivative of neo-Marxism or postmodernism, and can we get back to the original intent of postmodernism, which is good, and pull something good out of all this?
Yeah, well, if you were to take the original postmodernists it's difficult to say original postmodernists, because who do we mean by that? But let's take the French postmodernists of the 1960s, right? They would have torn apart the current social justice movement, because they were all about the demolition of grand narratives. And what the current social justice movement is a big meta-narrative. It is, we are on the right side of history. That's our meta-narrative. And they are also exerting power, or in the pursuit of power. It's certainly their power is tied up in their, what else are they doing but seizing control? So, like I say in the book, I mean, this is why I have that chapter where I trace the way in which those ideas that germinated within the 1960s French postmodernists, also to a degree elements of the Frankfurt School, these have informed and now underpin the present critical social justice movement, but they are not they have not followed on directly, and indeed I think often the critical social justice movement in its current form is a perversion of postmodernist ideas rather than an enactment of them. And I think that's quite an important distinction. Not least because most of them won't read Foucault anyway, and he would have problematized what they're getting up to. So I think
word.
yeah, exactly. And I think a lot of it has come about by accident. It's a kind of it's a form of evolution or devolution or whatever it is. But a lot of it has come about through fashion, I think. These ideas, for some reason, for whatever reason, became fashionable in higher education, in academe, and then it became difficult to challenge them because academics were quoting each other. And when I was at university, like Foucault was seen as a given, as a deity, as you would just have to cite Foucault and you didn't have to go any further than that. I remember being at a conference and an academic said that Foucault had said this thing, and I said, "Well, how did he know?" Because it was so speculative. He often did this when he talked about history, made these sort of claims. I was like, but how did he know that? He was talking about a sexual activity that the ancient Romans were in. He said they never did that. I'm like, how did he know? And this person didn't have an answer because the idea of questioning Foucault had never crossed him. Like it just wasn't something that was done. And so, I think that's a suggestion that it was fashion. It was fashion. It's fashionable. And I have friends in academia who tell me that Foucault is out of fashion in higher education, which I'm no longer in. But certainly those ideas have now seeped out into the mainstream. So what's very interesting is you can trace the lineage of this stuff, and you can see these echoes of, particularly with Foucault, with the nexus of power and knowledge. You can see where these things have come from. When people today talk about how jokes and words can normalize hate and violence, that has a Foucauldian precedent. You can see all of that. But that doesn't mean that they are disciples of Foucault in a strict sense. I don't think that's right. So I think that's why I don't spend too much time. I just spend one chapter on it because I think people need to understand why these ideas have germinated in the way that they have, where they've come from, but not necessarily to suggest a straightforward progression from French postmodernists to the political correctness of the 80s to the critical social justice movement of the 21st century. I think that's a more complicated thing.
Mm-hmm. There's your religion analogy. Like religionists say, as Augustine showed us, or as Aquinas taught us, as Derrida showed us, and as Foucault taught us, right? Sort of an argument for religious authority.
Derrida didn't show us anything, quite deliberately so.
That's right. That's the whole point. Right.
Yeah.
That's too funny. All right, Andrew, thank you so much for coming on the show. Thanks for your book. This is a great read. You are one of my favorite writers now. I would put you up there with Christopher Hitchens as just a brilliant writer. You're just a great writer. What do you attribute that to? Do you read a lot of other good writers and you just inculcate it? How does one become a good writer?
I'm very flattered that you've said that. That's very, very kind of you. And I don't know. I do read an awful lot. I always have. I think it's just, I think reading a lot is a really good thing to do, and I don't think people do it enough. Yeah. But I'm lucky in a way. I'm lucky because I actually love reading, and I know I have friends for whom it's a chore, and they don't, I don't lend them books because I can see that look in their eyes, like, oh God, am I going to have to read this now? But I actually really love doing it.
Well, your book just came out yesterday, and you're always busy on social media with Titania's feed there. But what's in the future for your research and writing?
I am going to write a new book, and I've already kind of got the go ahead to do that from the publisher. Nice. But it will have nothing to do with the culture war, and I mustn't say what it's about because maybe the project will get ditched. Who knows? But I don't want to jinx it. But it's nothing at all to do with the culture war, and I just want to do. I always want to do something different. You know what I mean? I tend to do things for a few years and then move on to something else. So I wish I could tell you more.
No, that's all right. You don't want to be one of those authors that writes the same book over and over, which there are some that do that because that's what they know. We all like to be comfortable in what we know. So very good.